What dark family secret was exposed and how did it happen? Story 1. Suri Owasin once. My great-great-grandfather owed a gambling debt to his former best friend. Apparently, after a night of gambling in which my ancestor somehow cheated or wronged his best friend, a firefight erupted at my great-great-grandfather's house. His best friend pulled a shotgun on him, but missed and accidentally shot his own wife, who was visiting my great-great-grandfather's wife at the time. My ancestor was hit in the neck by a single buckshot pellet, which remained lodged in his neck for the rest of his life. Several months later, my great-great-grandfather disappeared. After an extensive manhunt, a body was found cut into 3 pieces on the railroad tracks. The head was missing, but whoever discovered the remains retrieved a 6-gun and a whiskey flask from the body. When the items were brought back, my great-great-grandmother identified them as belonging to her husband. Now for the big twist. Rumor has it that my ancestor had another family in a different state, where he would frequently disappear for long periods. The head of the body on the tracks was never found. According to family legend, my great-great-grandfather may have killed another man, placed his own belongings on the body and disposed of the head. This way he could escape his debts and his blood feud, vanishing to live permanently with his second family. Rest in peace, great-great-grandpa Charles. You weren't exactly an upstanding citizen. Story 2. My mother once told me a chilling story about attending a small funeral in East Texas in the late 1950s. The deceased was a mentally challenged child, and the family seemed relieved, believing the child was finally at peace. During the service, the coffin suddenly began to rock, and the sound of crying could be heard from inside. My mother was quickly taken outside, where she watched in horror as the coffin was rushed to the cemetery next to the church and hastily buried. Years later, I was telling my kids this story when my mother walked into the room, listened for a moment, and casually asked, "Are you telling them about Uncle Chucky?" "What? Mom, you failed to mention that minor detail before." Story 3. I was in the military when I found out my grandpa was on his deathbed. I jumped through several hoops to take a week of emergency leave so I could attend his funeral and support my dad through the ordeal. I spent the week helping the family as much as I could. 2 days before the funeral, I learned the truth. My grandpa was a predator. He had assaulted several of my cousins and had even attempted to assault my sister. Most of my family had heard rumors, but they never knew he had gone after my sister too. Despite everything, everyone still attended the funeral under the pretense of supporting my grandma, even though she was in complete denial and claimed the kids had made it all up. I can't look at her the same way anymore. And even though I love my family, I don't understand how they can act like this never happened. I left the morning of the funeral. That man didn't deserve a peaceful death, and I can only hope someone waters the flowers on his grave with something less than respectful. Story 4. My great-grandfather was a bootlegger and later allegedly a cannibal during the Great Depression. I say allegedly because his friends claimed it was just a rumor he started to keep people from messing with his family. However, no one could ever disprove it, because even up until his death, he swore he had eaten a rival's liver. I should note that he was Native American, which earned him the nickname Wen, short for Wendigo. My grandpa always said it was all just for show. Wen had to fight for basic necessities like milk, and even had to threaten power company employees to keep them from shutting off their electricity. I have no idea how much of it is true, though, because the stories seem to be embellished more and more, right up until my grandpa passed away. Story 5. My great-aunt and uncle were the sweetest people imaginable. When I was growing up, they lived 4 houses down, so I used to visit them a lot after school. My Uncle Jimmy would play dolls and have tea parties with me. I have nothing but fond memories of them. When Uncle Jimmy passed away, I remember seeing all these very professional-looking older men at his funeral, many of them surrounded by what looked like security guards. I thought it was strange, but I was just a kid. Many years later, my mom casually mentioned that Uncle Jimmy had been an old-school English gangster. He had served time for robbery and other crimes. He had also been accused of taking multiple lives, but there was never enough evidence to prosecute. I was stunned. To make things even worse, my beloved Auntie Diane, his wife, was the madam of one of his brothels. She had recruited women for his operation and had also served time. That's when I put 2 and 2 together. Those men at his funeral, they weren't just guests. They were old gangsters. Realizing the truth about the people I had adored as a child really messed me up. Story 6. It's not exactly dark per se, but my great uncle on my father's side is widely considered an idiot. My dad's family were recent immigrants from Italy, and I guess my great uncle decided he wanted to visit his homeland. He was born there but raised in America. The problem was that he was completely oblivious to what was going on in the world because he went to Italy in 1938. He ended up getting drafted into the Italian military since he was born there. Unfortunately for him, he didn't realize that he didn't actually have to join. If he had reached out to an embassy or sought legal help, the US government would have contested it. Luckily, he was only assigned to patrol duty within Italy, and before the Allies advanced far enough to encounter him, Italy surrendered and turned on Mussolini. It was all apparently very awkward since my grandfather and the rest of his brothers had been in the US military fighting in Europe at the same time. Story 7. I've been looking into my ancestry recently and was completely confused when I stumbled across one of my grandmother's birth certificates. It listed a female in the father section. Turns out my great-grandmother, who had lived in a major port city in her youth, got pregnant by a foreign sailor who was never heard from again. At the time, a mother couldn't legally register a newborn with the authorities. It had to be her husband or another male guardian. Since she had none, her aunt, whom she lived with at the time, had to step in and handle the paperwork. She ended up putting her own name in the father box. Story 8. There's a long history of abuse in my family on my dad's side. I don't know all the details, but from what I've gathered, my great-grandfather may have been abusive toward my dad. He was also violent toward his wife and daughter, my grandmother. No one talks about it directly since he passed away years ago, but there's always a lingering tone of disgust whenever he comes up in conversation. Even my happy-go-lucky grandfather, who is a kind man now, was abusive toward my dad when he was younger. Unfortunately, that left my dad severely damaged, and he ended up being abusive toward my mom. Thankfully, never toward my sister and me. He wanted to stop the cycle of child abuse, but it didn't translate to how he treated his spouse. Eventually, my mom divorced him, he got therapy, and he's doing much better now. I refuse to continue the cycle. It's not easy. I have anger issues too, but there's no way I'm letting my son grow up the way his predecessors did. Story 9. My great-grandparents were first cousins. They had 2 sons who were severely intellectually disabled. Instead of putting them in an institution, which was the common practice at the time, my great-grandparents bought a farm in the countryside and kept them at home. Both sons passed away at a young age. My grandmother never spoke about any of this. I only found out after she died while doing genealogical research. On another note, my maternal grandmother had a stillborn son. She told me about giving birth to him once. I was her caregiver during her final year, and she described how they buried him at the feet of a single woman who had passed away. None of my mother's siblings ever knew about this. She also had 2 miscarriages. That meant 8 pregnancies and 5 surviving children. Story 10. My grandfather may have been a war criminal. He was born in the UK to a German family and spent half of his childhood in Germany. For the rest of his life, he could fool native Germans into thinking he was one of them, before switching seamlessly back into a perfect Yorkshire accent. He never talked much about the war. We knew he was a special weapons expert and was recalled by the Army for consultations well into the 1980s. But some of the stories he did share sounded like scenes straight out of Inglourious Bastards. We're pretty sure he spent several days embedded with an Afrika Korps support battalion, sabotaging it from the inside, before sneaking out at night in a half-track loaded with their last working weapons. We know that on at least one occasion, he personally drove a lorry into a Wehrmacht arms dump to deliver shells and bullets. Except the ones he delivered were duds, and the truck carrying the real ammunition mysteriously never made it. He was a member of the British Army the whole time. What exactly was going on remains a mystery, but one thing is clear. The Geneva Convention is pretty strict about never wearing enemy uniforms on the battlefield. Story 11. My ancestors are from North India. Before the partition, our family was spread across what is now Pakistan, Himachal, and Kashmir. On my dad's side, I have 118 second cousins. He has 55 cousins himself. On my mom's side, however, I only have 16 second cousins. I later found out why. Nearly my entire maternal grandmother's family was massacred during the partition. They lived in what is now Pakistan and didn't make it across the border in time. She refuses to tell us how she escaped or how she made it to India. But at some point she found her older brother who had already settled in Himachal, so she at least had some family left. On my maternal grandfather's side, many of his relatives died from disease. And I'm fairly certain that one of my great aunts, a Muslim woman, was forced into marriage as some form of revenge during that time. Members of my grandfather's family were also killed during the partition. There was a lot of blood on both sides of my family. We live in the U.S. now, but I remain fascinated by these stories. Story 12. I always knew that my grandmother had my oldest uncle out of wedlock, and that she was already pregnant with a second child when she married my grandfather. He must have been a brave man to take on someone else's child, especially in the 1930s. Years later, after my parents had passed, I was doing some family history research. That's when I realized something. My uncle's birth date and my grandma's birth date didn't add up. She would have been only 14 or 15 when she had him. The father was supposedly some wealthy man who took advantage of her when she worked in his estate. That's all I've ever been told. It's hard to imagine when I think of my grandmother, the sweet little old lady I knew even in the few photos we have of her when she was younger. It's difficult to picture her in that situation, and I guess now I'll never know the full story. Story 13. I had always heard stories about my great-aunt being blind, but I had never actually met her. When I finally did, I noticed the scars on her temple. After she left, I asked my grandpa, her brother, about them. When she was young, the town she lived in had a serial attacker on the loose. Her husband worked at the gun store my grandpa managed. One night, her husband told her he was going out and reminded her to lock the door because of the danger. She did as he said. A few hours later, she saw on the news that the attacker had been trapped in a house and was holding a woman and her daughter hostage. He was attempting to negotiate with the police. As she watched, he leaned out the window, holding the young girl and yelling something at the officers. That's when she recognized him. It was her husband. She went upstairs, grabbed his gun, and put it to her temple. I have no idea what happened to him. I didn't ask. He's probably either dead or in prison. Story 14. This is more about my birth parents' dark history. I was adopted at 3 months old, along with my 2 older sisters, who were 2 and 4 at the time. We also had an older stepsister who went into the foster system, as well as 3 older half-brothers who were taken in by aunts and uncles. I'm not sure of their exact ages, but I believe they were in their teens. Growing up, my adoptive parents always told us that the government forced our birth parents to put us up for adoption and that our birth father was in prison. That was it. No further details. By the time I was around 16, social media had taken off, and I was able to find most of my birth family. I ended up connecting with my older half-brother because we both had a past with substance use and shared a passion for marijuana. That's when I learned the truth. My birth father was a terrible person. He had adopted a girl and used her in the worst way imaginable. He once choked her with a telephone cord in front of the other kids. He assaulted 2 women and 2 teenage girls. He ended up serving 8 years in prison. And here's the worst part. My mother knew everything. She could have kept us, but all she had to do was never get back together with him. Instead, she let all of us go, and to this day, she is still with him. I remember looking at pictures of my younger sister, the one she was pregnant with at the time, and feeling sick. She looked like she had been through years of neglect and mistreatment. Story 15. My grandfather made a series of really odd and poor decisions in his teaching career. He left a well-paying job in an affluent school district to move his family across the country to teach at a Christian high school, which didn't work out. Then years later, he left a full-time professorship at a local Christian college to teach high school chemistry right as his own children were starting college there. This meant they lost access to free tuition. At the time, it just seemed like another one of his bad career moves typical for my grandfather, whose life was full of impulsive decisions and get-rich-quick schemes. That's what I believed until I started college there myself. I worked in a department where part of my job was organizing old employee records. If a professor had been fully hired at any point, their file was kept permanently. One day I found my grandfather's file, even though he had been gone for years and had passed away 2 years earlier. Right on top was a letter from the 1990s. It explained that when he returned to work as an adjunct professor, he had been cleared to come back after demonstrating proper repentance to his wife and showing remorse for his actions. That's when it hit me. My grandfather didn't leave his job because of some personal whim. He was fired. As a married man with 4 teenage children, he had engaged in an inappropriate relationship with an undergraduate student. To this day, my mom and I are the only ones in the family who know the truth. Story 16. I doubt anyone knows exactly who I am, so here goes. My brother has a daughter that no one knew about. About 10 years ago, I was moving out of the college town where I had lived for a decade after graduating. We were having a going-away party, and a few of our friends were longtime residents of the town. I overheard one of them talking about how years ago she had cared for a young woman in her early 20s who was dying of cancer. I casually said, "That's odd. That sounds like my brother's ex-girlfriend." She suddenly turned to me and said, "Your ex-ex-ex's brother?" As if it had taken her a decade to realize that two guys with the same last name and a striking resemblance might actually be related. I confirmed it, and she told me that yes, she had cared for my brother's ex. Then she asked how he was doing. I told her he was great. He had just gotten married and had his first child. That's when she said, "That's not his first child." My jaw dropped. Apparently during college, my brother and his ex had spent a summer in Chicago. This would have been about 30 years ago, back when I was in high school. They had a baby, kept it a secret, and gave the child up for adoption. My brother had been keeping tabs on his daughter ever since, but he never told anyone. Then they broke up, she got sick, and she passed away, and now I understand why my brother drank so much for those few years. Story 17. I learned that my grandfather murdered my grandmother 3 months before I was born. At the time, he was a member of the Pritchard, Alabama Police Department. He managed to make her death look like a Suez and collected a huge insurance payout. The official story might have been believable, except when my aunt tried to look into her mother's death, she found that all the records were court sealed. My mother later told me that my grandmother had recently gotten her driver's license and a job and had been excited about becoming a grandmother. Turns out she had been planning to leave my grandfather. After he passed, I finally had a chance to go through some old photos. In one box, I found pictures of him posing with his Klan buddies. Also in 1983, the year I was born, the Pritchard Police Department was at the peak of its corruption. That fact can still be found in old newspapers. No one in the family wants to talk about this. The only surviving member of my dad's side is my father, but I don't speak to him. Story 18. Pretty normal situation. So my dad's dad was a cop and a prison guard back in 1976. Money was tight. There were 4 kids at the time, with my dad being the oldest son. Feeding that many mouths wasn't easy. One day the kids came home from school to find the police at their house. Their mom, my grandmother, was crying, but she seemed oddly calm. She told them, "Dad is gone." And that was the end of the story. My dad was only 8 years old. Not long after, my grandmother started abusing him and one of his younger sisters. My dad would avoid going home as much as possible, instead running to his grandmother's house, my great-grandmother. No matter how late it was, she would always take him in and feed him. As time went on, things at home got worse. My grandmother would make the kids strip down and lie on the bed while she beat them with a belt. Her hand, or whatever else, was within reach. Eventually, she met a man, started dating him, and they got married. We'll call him Steve. While they were dating, she kept the abuse under control. But after they got married, it only escalated. Steve, meanwhile, played the nice guy. He would tell my dad and his sister in private that he would try to calm their mother down when she was in a rage. This led to him getting particularly close to my aunt. When she was around 11 or 12, Steve started taking advantage of her after she had been beaten. It destroyed her. She started bringing men home to sleep with for money. This continued until my dad was about 15 or 16. Eventually, my grandmother divorced Steve after having 4 kids with him. Years later, the family finally learned what had happened to my dad's father. He had been killed while robbing a bank. In fact, he had been responsible for multiple bank robberies in the area during that period when money was tight. My dad still remembers hearing his mother scream at his father, "I don't care what you do, just get the money." The irony, a man from their church who had donated blood in an attempt to save my grandfather's life later married my grandmother. They're still together to this day. As for my dad, the years of abuse left permanent damage. When my mom went to a chiropractor for back pain, my dad decided to get an x-ray as well. The doctor took one look and asked what kind of traumatic accident he had survived, because his spine vertebrae and other bones showed clear signs of extensive blunt force trauma. That was when all his repressed memories started coming back. He called his sister to confirm that he wasn't making things up. She burst into tears. She had never spoken about it to anyone. She later admitted that she's been through 5 marriages because she can't feel love unless she's being hurt. The hardest part, All 8 of my grandmother's children remained close. They always got together for holidays. No one ever referred to each other as half-siblings. They were just family, which means Steve had been attending family gatherings for years. He passed away earlier this year. My dad doesn't want to tell his 4 half-brothers about what happened, especially with Steve's recent passing. It's too painful. Only a few people know the truth. My mom, my aunt, my grandmother, and now me, my wife, and my sister. Well, and my dad's therapist. Thank God for that therapist. My dad broke the cycle. He never passed the abuse down. He hit my mom once when I was a baby. He immediately left for a week to get his head straight. Knowing that his family was worth more than repeating what had been done to him, he never raised a hand again. Today, he has been wildly successful, rising from the mailroom to a regional manager position in a Fortune 500 company in just 4 years. He taught me that the only thing that controls you is you. As cheesy as it sounds, by the grace of God, my family turned out okay. His therapist still urges him to turn his story into a movie. We'll see. Story 19. This will probably get buried, but I found out when I was about 12 that my dad had been married before he met my mom. Turns out they had an affair. My mom became pregnant with me. I had always known that my parents got married after I was born, when my mom was already pregnant with my brother. But finding out that my mom had been the other woman, that I was the product of an affair, was shocking. His first wife found out when my very pregnant mother showed up at the hospital to visit my father while he was sick. That was the end of the marriage. I never knew what became of my father's first wife, but I think about her often. To be betrayed by a younger woman, to watch your husband start a family with someone else while you remain childless, it must have been devastating. I hope she found happiness. Story 20. When I was a kid, my father went to Alabama to attend the funeral of my great-grandmother, someone I had only met on a few rare occasions as a child. She lived on a 15-acre plot of land in a ghost town called Repton. That land was part of a larger 100-acre lot that had been divided among her siblings, which in turn had been part of an even larger plot passed down through generations. She was also the last of our family to be buried in our family graveyard in that town. Many of the graves date to circa the early 1800s. A few years later, my parents showed our family a huge slideshow of old photos from my great-grandmother's house that had been digitized. Some of the photos showed my great-grandfather and his father working on a farm on the very same plot of land where my great-grandmother had lived. Was that plot of land always a farm? Yep, your great-grandfather was the last one to work the farm. It used to be several hundred acres, but over time it was sold off or given to relatives to live on. Huge plot of land dedicated to farming passed down through family lines. Family graveyard dating back to before the Civil War, Alabama. And that is how I learned my family owned a slave plantation. Story 21. My grandma once tried a dangerous makeshift procedure to abort my mom. At the time, she already had 6 children, and they were living in poverty. This was before modern birth control was available. Obviously, it didn't work. And out of guilt, she made sure everyone knew that my mom was her favorite. My mom only found out the truth when Grandma was on her deathbed and began rambling about it. Grandma had always been very religious and staunchly pro-life, so the revelation came as a huge shock. I'm not sure if her extreme views stemmed from that incident, or if she was simply one of those who believed only her own choices were moral, but it was surprising nonetheless. Despite everything, my mom remains pro-choice. In her words, Grandma had the right to make that choice. After it failed, she chose to keep me instead of trying again. If I had been lost, it wouldn't have mattered. Story 22. I live in the United States. My mother brought me here from Mexico when I was 3 months old. Growing up in the US, I never knew what Mexico was like or what my family there was like. Now at 21 years old, I still remember one day in high school when my mom was on our desktop computer reading news from a major Mexican outlet. I can't recall which one. She called me over and asked me to look at an article. It was a picture of a man surrounded by crime scene tape. "What is it, Mom?" I asked. She told me that the man who had been murdered was my uncle. Since I knew so little about my extended family, I was immediately curious. I had often heard about shootings and random street crimes in major cities, but this wasn't one of those cases. My uncle had been involved with a cartel and had been shot approximately 9 times. Later, I found out the real reason my father never came with us to the US. My mother had left him because of similar ties. When they were married, he ran illicit substances across Mexico using a merchandise semi-truck. She had no idea until one day when he pulled over in a rural area and began unloading. After that, she left, never saw him again, and I have never met my father because of it. Another thing about my father, he has had multiple families, not just at the same time, but throughout his life. Quite the womanizer. One day I got a random friend request on Facebook from a young girl in Mexico. I asked my mom if she knew her, and she said no, but told me to add her anyway. After accepting the request, the girl messaged me and introduced herself as my sister. Apparently, he had abandoned her and her mother. According to my little sister, I have 11 siblings, including a full-blooded brother. Some live in the US and others are still in Mexico. I always think about how incredible it would be to meet all of them, but it feels nearly impossible. Story 23. My aunt had her first child when she was 14. She hid her pregnancy from her mom for as long as she could, but eventually the truth came out. To escape her mother's wrath, she moved in with her boyfriend's family. 30 years later, she and her husband are still together. Meanwhile, both of her siblings have been divorced and remarried. My other aunt was not my grandfather's biological child, but he absolutely adored her and treated her the same as his biological son, my dad. He endured years of emotional abuse from my grandmother just so he could make sure my aunt got the medical care she needed. She had polio and a serious heart condition at a very young age. I never knew any of this until after both my grandparents passed. On a darker note, my wife's cousin was arrested for possession and distribution of illegal content involving minors. His father told everyone that it was just a case of illegal downloading and that he'd be out in a year. After a year, we got curious and Googled his name. Turns out he'll be in prison for a few more years. Story 24. I'm probably a bit late to the party, but here goes anyway. When my dad was about 18, my grandfather had an affair with a woman from his theater group. She was also married. When the affair was discovered, her husband shot her and then attempted to take his own life. She didn't survive, he did. To this day, he works as a pharmacist in the same town with a new family. The fact that he used a gun was shocking because even though this was in the 1970s, it was Australia, where firearms were far from common even back then. As for my grandparents, my grandma, who was already struggling with severe depression, moved into a motel for a few weeks. Then she took her own life. My grandfather, in his usual fashion, handled the situation with complete detachment. He sent my dad a letter while he was away at college, casually informing him that his mother had overdosed on sleeping pills and died. According to my dad and an uncle, my grandfather has never expressed guilt. He eventually remarried a cold, distant woman who refuses to acknowledge his children or grandchildren as family. A couple of years ago, my aunt requested a copy of my grandmother's death certificate for personal reasons. That's when she learned the truth. Cause of death, hanging. Turns out my grandfather had lied. She hadn't overdosed. She had returned home, and he had found her hanging from a rope under the porch. And here's a twisted little addendum to the story. My aunt, who apparently shares a lot of similarities with her mother, has since befriended the daughter of the woman from the affair. She says it brings her some kind of closure. Story 25. I've posted this before, but I have an uncle I will never meet, and most likely another aunt somewhere in the US. My grandmother was a terrible person. My mother didn't even know she had a third sister until she was in her early 30s. And she never knew she had a brother until that third sister told her when they met for the first time. The reason my mother never knew about my auntie was that my grandmother basically gave her away on the courthouse steps. My Uncle R, whom I've never met and never will, was also given up. Although he harbors no ill will toward my mother and me, he wants nothing to do with us, which honestly I can't blame him for. I found out more about my Uncle R and my potential fourth aunt on my 18th birthday when my mother and I visited my grandmother's best friend. That's when I learned about all the awful things my grandmother had done. Her best friend mentioned that my mom has another sister, but she has no idea where she might be. My grandmother passed away from Alzheimer's and had dementia, so there's no way to fill in the blanks. Not that she would have, even if she were still alive. I'm the only one out of my 4 cousins who knows any of this. And it's strange watching my oldest cousin and her mother talk about how great my grandmother was when they don't know what I know. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. My grandmother was not a good person. Story 26. This is so late that it'll probably never be read, but whatever, only a few people in my life have ever been let in on this. Preface. My twin brother and I were born in the year 1980, Our parents divorced 5 years later for reasons unknown. When we were 8, we met an older half-brother who our dad had secretly given up for adoption 35 years earlier. He had found the family through a private investigator. He was accepted into the paternal side of the family and became incredibly attached to us. I also have another half-brother from my dad's previous marriage who was 16 years older and helped raise us. Anyway, my twin brother and I spent weekends with our dad as per child custody rules. During those weekends, my dad was emotionally abusive and manipulative. I never told anyone about what went on and felt ashamed, eventually distancing myself by age 15. That led to my brothers becoming angry with me, thinking I was just being a terrible person for avoiding him. I kept quiet for fear of tearing the family apart. The main story, I have always been really into genetics, so I decided to take a DNA test from 23, and me just for fun. I had already tested with another service and wanted to compare them. That's when I was matched with a biological paternal uncle, an uncle I wasn't supposed to have since my dad was an only child. At first I figured there could be several explanations, but I ended up calling my mom and pressing her for the truth. That's when I learned my father wasn't actually my biological father. Apparently before my birth, my dad had undergone cancer treatments that had left him nearly sterile. After 2 years of failed IVF or something similar, doctors gave my parents an option to use a sperm donor. However, they went with an unusual method. This was during the early days of sperm donation, not long after the first sperm bank had opened. The doctors suggested mixing some of my dad's sperm with an anonymous donor's, essentially making it possible, though unlikely, that my brother and I could still be biologically his. The idea was to make things easier psychologically for my father. My mom was given an anonymized list of about 10 potential donors with only basic details: height, hair color, and texture, eye color, occupation, and self-reported ethnicity. No photos. She picked the one that seemed like the best match, and it worked. My brother and I were conceived. Fast forward, within 24 hours of taking the DNA test, my entire sense of self crumbled. It felt like everything I thought I knew about who I was, my identity, my family, my world was wrong. I was in complete shock. I could barely look at myself because suddenly my own face, half of it, coming from some stranger, felt almost alien to me. My twin brother had a complete emotional breakdown. I emailed the biological uncle through the site briefly and politely explaining who I was, expecting him not to respond. But he did. Over the next month, we built up a discussion, and he confirmed that his brother, the man who was actually my biological father, would have done something like this. Without hesitation, he gave me a full name. It was strange how quickly he did that, and I almost suspected the guy was dead or something. As we talked more, I started getting the sense that he was avoiding certain topics about his brother, and that gave me a bad feeling. It was confusing because this family seemed incredibly successful and respectable. My biological father, on the other hand, was the complete black sheep of their prestigious Ivy League family. After college, he failed as an investment banker, became addicted to coca, and then crack, ended up homeless for over a decade, and was eventually arrested. He only got clean after being forced into rehab as part of a reduced sentence. He's clean now, but terrified that my twin brother and I exist. He's scared the rest of the family will judge him. He now lives in isolation, struggling every day to stay sober. Meanwhile, we met the uncle for the first time. The connection between us was immediate. It felt like we had always known each other. He was thrilled to meet us and desperately wanted to introduce us to the rest of the family. Turns out we have cousins our age living just 10 minutes away. Our paternal grandfather had died in their home only a mile from our childhood home 10 years ago. Our paternal grandmother, who shared our birthday, had lived nearby too. For all I know, I could have walked past my biological relatives on the street or stood next to them in a store without knowing it. The strangest part, my dad, the man who raised us, has no idea about any of this. And I suspect that some part of him always wondered if we weren't his biological children. Maybe that's why he treated me the way he did, but he never had a way to confirm it. He's now in the early stages of Alzheimer's. Our older brothers don't know the truth either. No one does except for my twin, my mom, and my stepdad. Life is unpredictable, and I have no idea how this will all turn out. Story 27. My cousins started digging around Ancestry.com and discovered that my grandparents didn't actually get married until my dad was 8 and my uncle was 5. They had just pretended they had been married all along. Then one weekend, they secretly ran off and made it official. Back then, having kids out of wedlock was a big deal, but I think it's pretty cool that my grandparents were ahead of their time. They were married for over 46 years, but together for nearly 60 before my grandmother passed away. Sometime after that, the same cousin found out again through ancestry records that my mom and dad had secretly married over a year before their big church wedding. Every year they celebrated their church wedding anniversary with a vacation, but all along they had also been quietly celebrating their real anniversary just between the two of them. My dad passed away suddenly this August, just 1 month before what would have been their 29th church wedding anniversary. Everyone who didn't know about their secret wedding felt sad for my mom, thinking they hadn't quite made it to 30 years of marriage. But in reality, my parents had already taken a nice vacation this June to celebrate their 30th anniversary. Story 28. I recently found out that my dad had attempted to take his own life when he was a young man. He was a top student excelling in a military academy until he suffered a traumatic brain injury (TBI) during a boxing match where he wasn't given proper medical care. His grades declined, and he struggled for the rest of his time at the academy, eventually graduating near the bottom of his class. Since then, he has had lifelong issues with focus and attention. Growing up, I had to repeat almost everything I ever said to him, to the point where it became automatic for me. Eventually, as an adult, I had to consciously train myself not to repeat everything I said to others. The depression he struggled with was successfully treated with medication, but the effects of that TBI stayed with him for the rest of his life. Story 29. You find out some surprising things at funerals. When my dad passed away, we discovered that he and my mom had actually eloped to Tijuana to get married. But months later, they found out their marriage wasn't legally recognized in the US. So they had to go to the courthouse in San Diego and get married again. We also found out that my dad's parents, who had both passed away, had divorced in the 1960s and stayed divorced for 10 years before remarrying. They never lived apart, which is why none of us grandkids ever knew. At my other grandfather's funeral, we learned something even more shocking. While he was in the Navy and stationed overseas, he used to visit brothels, mostly in Panama and Central America. My mom was devastated by this revelation, but honestly, I had always suspected something like that. He was gone for months at a time away from his wife, my mom's stepmother. Even more difficult to process was the fact that he had been a mean drunk to his 3 younger kids and mistreated them. That part really hurt. To me, he had always been my special grandpa, and our relationship felt like something out of a wholesome TV show. Reconciling that version of him with the man I learned about at his funeral was incredibly difficult. Story 30. I'm using a throwaway account because of the nature of this information. Even though it sounds far-fetched, this is the truth. I come from an ancient family whose history before the 11th century is mostly lost. However, records indicate that my ancestors were wealthy, powerful, and of royal lineage, with at least 14 kings and queens in the family line. In 1496, my 11th great-grandfather, King P, forged a strong alliance with the Spanish monarchy through his baptism into the Catholic faith around 1494. He then conspired with the conquistadors in the overthrow of his own kingdom. In recognition of his aid, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand granted him the title of Marquis, and he returned to what had once been his kingdom. Years later, in 1562, my 10th great-grandfather, who ruled over a wealthy aristocratic merchant family, oversaw and approved a business contract with the Earl of Ponte and the infamous privateer John Hawkins, who would later become Admiral Sir John Hawkins under Queen Elizabeth I. The Earl provided Hawkins with a significant shipment of goods, which Hawkins then transported to Sierra Leone. There he exchanged the merchandise for the first enslaved individuals to be shipped to the Americas, specifically Hispaniola. So essentially, my family was directly involved in the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade, an institution that caused immense suffering and whose consequences still ripple through history today. Story 31. At my grandfather's Wakan funeral 96 to 97, the room was filled with grieving family members. Alongside them were about 15 to 20 FBI agents. Apparently, my grandfather and his brother had once been the heads of the local Irish mob in Jersey City and NYC during the 1930s to 1950s. Nearly everyone in attendance had at some point been involved in questionable activities or unsolved crimes. The FBI was particularly interested in my grandfather's brother, who had been solely responsible for the deaths of around 8 members of the local Italian mob during a long-standing feud. According to their reports on multiple occasions, He had knocked out rival mobsters, stuffed them into suitcases, and thrown them off the Bayon Bridge while they were still trapped inside. The agents were there in case my grandfather's brother decided to show up, even though no one had seen or heard from him since the early 60s. The night eventually wound down, and after the FBI left, other guests and family members also started heading home. That's when my father introduced me to a man named John. He told me he hadn't seen John in a very long time, but that he was a good friend of my grandfather's. I shook his hand, introduced myself, and listened as he shared some funny stories about my grandfather and father. Eventually, John slipped away unnoticed, and the night came to an end. Years later, in casual conversation, I asked my father if John had actually been the uncle the FBI had been searching for. He just nodded and said, "Yep." Apparently, he had been living a quiet life in South Carolina, under an alias, raising a large family of his own. He passed away years ago, so at this point, there's not much the FBI could do. Story 32. When I was little, my grandfather was always a bit of a mystery. I remember telling him about movies I had seen in theaters, things like Toy Story or other kids' films, and he would always say that he had seen them too. When I asked who he had gone with, he would casually reply, "Oh, I went by myself." Even as a kid, I thought it was strange that an older man would go to a children's movie alone, and it wasn't just once. He had done it a few times. When I was about 10, my grandmother, his wife, passed away. A few months later, my mom sat my brother and me down to tell us something shocking. Years before I was born, my grandfather had an affair, and from that affair, a child had been born. We had an uncle we had never known about. My grandfather had kept this secret from us, but before she passed, my grandmother had insisted that the truth be revealed. I didn't uncover the secret myself, but I almost revealed it by accident years earlier without realizing it. My mother told me that when I was about 3 or 4 years old, I had been at the park with my grandmother from my dad's side. At some point, my ball rolled away from me, and when I went to retrieve it, a boy picked it up and handed it back to me. That boy was my uncle, just a few years older than me. At that time, no one knew about the affair or the child, but my grandfather had been at the park that day too. And when he spotted me talking to my uncle, he must have panicked. Before my other grandmother could get to me, my grandfather quickly took the boy and left. To this day, that moment remains one of the biggest and darkest secrets in my family history. Story 33. What I learned about one single human being, my father, he got a 14-year-old girl pregnant. My mom when he was 24. Around the same time, he also got another girl pregnant. This one was 18. He later complained that my mom looked older than she was, even though he literally watched her step off a middle school bus. He has been married 4 times and cheated on every single wife. When he was married to my mom, his first wife, he was physically abusive and gave her multiple STDs. At 50, he contracted hepatitis, either from drugs or unprotected encounters, and had to be nursed back to health by his elderly mother. He took advantage of an elderly woman manipulating her and essentially taking her house. He also won a lawsuit against a major electric company after being electrocuted by a busted transformer while on the job. He walked away with $1 million settlement, but left out the fact that he had been on speed when the accident happened. He had also been selling meth to many of his co-workers in the oil field. Later, he stole his own daughter's identity, my sister, opening multiple credit cards in her name and destroying her credit before she even reached adulthood. Worst of all, he committed a horrific crime against his own niece after drugging her with pills and meth. He's 74 now, so he can't do much more damage, at least physically. But despite everything, my stepsister and sister still foolishly trust him around their children. Given his history, that's a terrifying thought. He has spent his life objectifying and mistreating the women around him, and I have no doubt he will do the same to his granddaughters. Story 34. Turns out my cousin is actually more closely related to me than we originally thought. The last time I told this story, people got confused, so I'll use names this time. My mother, Jean, has a sister named Tammy. My father, Bart, has a brother named Sam. Aunt Tammy married someone else not important to the story and had a son named Brad. Brad and I always looked pretty similar, but we never thought much of it. After all, our moms were sisters, so it made sense that we would resemble each other. We weren't identical by any means, but we looked more like siblings than cousins. It wasn't until later that I learned the truth. Aunt Tammy had been having an affair with Uncle Sam, my dad's brother. So Brad isn't just my cousin. He is the child of both my mother's sister and my father's brother. My mom knew the moment she saw baby Brad. She recognized certain features, his feet, his ears, and immediately suspected something was off. My dad ended up in the doghouse for a solid month until Tammy finally admitted the truth. Story 35. My grandmother was overly handsy with me and my brother when we were kids. She was also emotionally manipulative toward my grandfather. He was close to a promotion and a pay raise with added benefits before leaving the Navy, but my grandmother would constantly threaten to harm herself if he didn't come back home sooner. Eventually he gave in, of course. The other vague memories I have of my grandmother mostly involve her going out drinking with her friends from the travel agency she worked at. I imagine she wasn't around much for the kids when my grandpa left the Navy. She also made sure to cut out every single woman from the photos my grandfather had from his travels. Some were ex-girlfriends from before he met her. He talks about them sometimes, and they all seem like decent people. My grandfather on my mother's side, on the other hand, was one of the kindest people I've ever met. I always looked up to him. He worked incredibly hard as the captain of a fishing boat for over 30 years. A lot of what shaped me into who I am today came from the lessons he shared with me when he realized he was starting to suffer from dementia. He would tell me how to treat others with respect, how to truly listen, and how to be a better person overall. He encouraged me to nurture the relationships that mattered most, and when I found someone special, to love them wholeheartedly and always do my best for them. My grandmother on my father's side, though, had a completely different perspective. She would constantly rant about how my mom's side of the family was to blame for my other grandfather's dementia, even saying he deserved to have it. My aunt seemed cool when we were kids, but as my brother and I got older, we started to see how emotionally abusive she was toward my uncle and their daughter. I'm not sure if she was physically abusive, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised. What once seemed like quirks turned out to be intense emotional demands she placed on everyone around her. We also learned she was a huge bully in school. She used to fight other kids and got away with it by calling it self-defense. It probably helped that she was one of the star cheerleaders at the time. She treasures those years like they were the peak of her life. She also used to bully my dad mercilessly. She and my grandmother would laugh while he was upset, expecting him to just take it like a man. My brother even went to live with her for a year after high school, when home life became too stressful. That's when we started hearing more about how she treated our uncle, screaming at him while he tried to stay calm and reason with her. She would throw blame around over the smallest things, like a single dish left in the sink. If my brother was there, he would get the brunt of one of her screaming fits, even if it wasn't his dish. If my uncle or their daughter tried to defend him, she would lash out at them too, accusing them of protecting him from his mistakes. Then there's my dad. Back in high school, when my mom broke up with him, he's 3 years older than her. He went to her house, banged on the door, and yelled at her until she opened up to talk. Of course, talking just meant him pressuring her into getting back together. Even now, he refuses to look for real work. If he does take a job, it has to be as low effort as possible, just so he can come home, complain about how exhausting it is to do nothing, and then drink in front of the TV. Growing up, he was always yelling at my brother and me. When I asked family about it later, they told me he had always been like that, even before we were born. He would get into screaming matches with my grandmother over petty nonsense, and there was no peace in that house. My grandmother would bully him while constantly praising my aunt as the perfect daughter. When we were kids, he used to tell my brother and me to turn the TV volume all the way up while he dragged my mom into the pantry. He would yell at her, and who knows what else happened behind that door. All I knew was that afterward, my mom would come out crying and silent, go upstairs, and we wouldn't see her again for the rest of the day. Dad would then walk out acting like nothing had happened, telling us everything was fine. If I asked about Mom, he would get angry and start scolding me. A lot of times when I talked back or asked too many questions, he would hold my mouth open and put hot sauce on my tongue to make me stop. I hated it. It burned like hell. Nowadays, I avoid them as much as possible. My grandmother is dying from kidney failure, and my brother and I match her blood type, but when she asked for a transplant, we both declined. As for my aunt, it's only a matter of time. Her daughter will be out of high school soon, and I wouldn't be surprised if my uncle finally leaves her. And my dad, he's in for a rude awakening. My younger sister is also about to graduate, and once she's out of the house, my mom plans to leave him. She makes 90% of the income, so when she finally goes, he'll be out of luck. Exactly what he deserves. Story 36. My partner's family doesn't have a particularly dark history, but there's an ongoing mystery that we're still trying to piece together. His great-grandmother B raised his maternal grandmother M as a single mother in the 1930s. They were never able to find out who M's father was. She was born in 1929, and through researching historical documents, we discovered a marriage certificate from 1916 showing that B had been married to a man named R. We searched for R's name in war death records but found nothing. If he survived World War I, then the question remains what happened in the 15 years between his marriage to B and the birth of M. Was he actually M's father, or was there another story behind it? We were able to track down R's family tree. He was one of 7 brothers, all of whom were the right age to have served in either or both world wars. Interestingly, he has a nephew who is still alive and now in his 80s. Unfortunately, records in this country are only released after 100 years, meaning we would have to wait until 2018 to access any post-war documents or until 2021 to see the 1921 census. By then, of course, R's nephew may have passed, if he even knows the truth at all. Story 37. My father passed away in 1989 when I was 28. His funeral was held in his hometown in Kentucky, and the process from the viewing to the burial lasted 3 days. During that time, I spent hours in the funeral home's lounge, drinking coffee and talking with my uncle and older cousins. Because I was the youngest of my generation, and my father rarely discussed family matters, I never knew much about our history. At 28, I was finally told a lot of things that had been kept from me. The biggest revelation was that my maternal grandmother had taken her own life just a few years before the World War II. Growing up, every summer, my family would travel from Florida to Kentucky to visit my dad's relatives. It was a routine we never missed, and those visits remain some of my happiest childhood memories. I heard countless family stories from my uncles, aunts, and cousins, but my grandmother was rarely mentioned. It wasn't until my father's funeral that I learned the truth. She had ended her life by jumping into a well in 1939. Looking back, I realize now that they didn't fully understand depression back then, and because of the stigma surrounding it, they simply chose not to talk about it. Story 38. Oh boy, I have a lot. To start, one of my 8th or 9th great-grandfathers, Reverend Roland Taylor, was burned at the stake in England under the reign of Bloody Mary. However, a guard took pity on him and ended his suffering with a halberd before the flames could fully consume him. His uncle-in-law, William Tyndale, met a similar fate. He was executed for translating the Bible into English, which was highly controversial at the time. Jumping ahead a few generations, my 3rd or 4th great-grandmother lived alone in Missouri after being widowed. One night, while putting the cows in the barn, she was brutally murdered with an axe. Everyone in town knew who had done it, but due to a lack of evidence, no conviction was ever made. The suspect skipped town and was never seen again. And then there's my grandmother's story. She was from a Pomeranian town called Demmin. When the Soviets advanced through the area, many of the town's residents chose to take their own lives rather than face what was coming. The local pharmacist dispensed poison, though it wasn't always strong enough. Some people woke up a day or two later, realizing their attempts had failed. Mothers carried their babies into the river with backpacks full of rocks to make sure they wouldn't survive. The most disturbing case, though, was the town's teacher. As the Soviets approached with white flags hanging from nearly every building, he killed his entire family. Then he grabbed a Panzerfaust, a grenade launcher designed for tanks, and fired at the advancing Soviet troops before hanging himself. Luckily, neither of my great-grandparents were involved with the Nazi Party, so instead of choosing that path, they simply fled west. Story 39. This will probably get buried, but I have a good one. My dad passed away when I was 13. I was told he died of hypothermia after getting his truck stuck in the woods during the winter. That was the official story. Years later, I found out the truth. He had actually taken his own life because the car dealership he managed, which was one of the largest in the world at the time, for pioneering online car sales, was under investigation. The authorities had uncovered a massive drug smuggling operation connected to the dealership, making it one of the biggest coca distribution hubs in the Northwest United States. He was the only one they had solid evidence against, thanks to things he had said on a tapped phone in our house. Facing the possibility of prison and unwilling to turn on his associates, he chose to end his life instead. At first, I didn't believe it, but in our small town, it was practically an open secret. This November marks 12 years since it happened. Story 40. My grandmother was raised as an only child. She had an older sister who passed away shortly after birth due to spina bifida, but other than that, she grew up believing she had no siblings and lived a generally happy life. A few years ago, while researching our family history, she made a shocking discovery. She found two birth certificates, twins, a brother and sister born to her mother. They had been placed for adoption immediately after birth. The names matched our family's rare surname, confirming they were definitely related. The strangest part, her father's name wasn't listed on the birth certificates. She had been too young at the time to remember her mother's pregnancy, so she had never suspected a thing. After years of searching, she finally made contact only to find out that her twin brother had passed away not long before. However, she was able to reconnect with her sister, and they now have a relationship. They briefly considered doing a paternity test, but ultimately decided against it. Story 41. When I was a kid, maybe around 3 years old, I had a very vivid memory that stuck with me well into my early teens. I remember being in the kitchen so small that I couldn't even see over the counter. The doorbell rang and my mom answered it. Standing there was the woman who ran my daycare, one of my mom's closest friends. She was holding several plastic Tupperware containers trying to give them back. Then my mom started screaming at her. It was completely out of character. I was so young that I didn't understand what was happening. I thought maybe the woman had taken the Tupperware without asking, and that's why my mom was so upset. Years later, when I was about 13, I realized how ridiculous that was. Obviously, my mom wouldn't react like that over Tupperware, so I asked her about it. She brushed it off and told me to drop it. I brought it up again a year later, and she still refused to talk about it. Finally, the next year, I got a partial answer. My older sister had a fight with my dad and stormed into my room furious. She told me, "You should hate him too. You know Dad cheated on Mom, right?" I started crying and confronted my parents. They sat me down, reassured me that everything was okay, and told me they had worked through it. That was all. I accepted their explanation and didn't question it further. 8 years later, I learned the full truth. I was in college and my sisters and I had a girls' weekend. We went out drinking, reminiscing about our childhood. At some point, I brought up my memory of the Tupperware incident. I started telling the story, and before I could even finish, my sister blurted out, "And she was holding all those Tupperware containers." That stopped me in my tracks. In my memory, I hadn't remembered my sister being there, so I had never asked her about it before. But now that it was out in the open, my sisters looked at each other and finally decided to tell me everything. My mom's best friend, the one who owned the daycare, had been having an affair with my dad. She would babysit my sister, and while my sister played in the other room, my dad and the woman would be together. Eventually, another friend of theirs found out and called my mom to tell her everything. The woman on the phone told my mom that the affair meant nothing to my dad and that he had even blamed her for his actions. My mom locked herself in her room for 3 days playing Fast Car by Tracy Chapman on repeat. My dad moved out, taking my older brother with him. After a month, my mom let them come back. She forgave my dad, and they never discussed it with us again. At the time, my older siblings were 16 and 14, old enough to have some idea of what was going on. But for me, my parents just acted like nothing had happened. The fallout was devastating. My brother dropped out of school, got involved with drugs, and ended up in and out of jail and rehab. He never fully recovered from the pain of it all. My mom, one of the kindest and sweetest people I've ever known, had to live with the betrayal of both her husband and her best friend. The next day I called my mom. I told her I needed to talk to her, that it was important. We each drove 2 hours and met halfway. I made her tell me everything. It was still painful for her, even after all these years. I told her she was crazy for forgiving him. She just sighed and told me it was one of the hardest things she had ever done. Story 42. My great-grandmother on my mom's dad's side lived in the same house from 1930 until she passed away at 100 years old a few years ago. During the 1950s, she rented out a small attic suite in her home to boarders. She had all kinds of people stay there, students, laborers, and even small families. She would tell us stories about some of her boarders and even had photos of them. There was one family in particular that she found a little odd. They were what she called party animals and had a small boy with them. She also recalled that they had 2 older daughters, but for some reason the girls didn't live with them anymore. They came from a larger town nearby, and my great-grandmother suspected they were in some kind of trouble with the law. Years later, we realized something shocking. That family was my dad's parents, and the little boy was him. His parents had been running from the police in Toronto because his father, my grandfather, was a bit of a wild card and had gotten into trouble. They had to lay low for a while, and my great-grandmother unknowingly gave them a place to stay. She remembered that the woman's name was Ruth, my dad's mother, and she even had an old picture of her in the house. Ruth had already passed away by the time we made this connection, but when we told my dad, he vaguely remembered moving a lot when he was little. It only got worse. He spread vicious rumors about one of his own children, falsely claiming they had HIV/AIDS in the early 80s, when stigma around the disease was at its peak.